Hi there, as you can see on the screen, I've just finished the conference for today that was scheduled. Um, I'm not entirely sure whether it recorded correctly, so I'm going to just quickly do a very short video now to make sure that you do get some feedback if you were unable to join me. Okay, so first of all then, let's look at the first question. So I'm going to change the page layout so we can see the whole of the page. So view, print layout, and zoom in a little bit more. Okay, so page width. Okay, right. So with reference to the case study in the article, so this is an important aspect in business and management. You're going to have to refer to the stimulus that you've been given, okay, to make it so you're answering the question in context and not answering it generally. So you can't necessarily just learn lots of content in business and management and just regurgitate it and get full marks. You need to be able to apply it. Okay, so that's why you have lots of stimulus in terms of articles and situations there. You also need to distinguish between the objectives of the private and public sector. Okay, this is worth 4 marks, so you're not supposed to be writing war and peace about it. A couple of paragraphs will do it. Okay, now how I would do this is look at what needs to be shown understanding of. So I need to show that I know the difference between private sector and public sector objectives. So in my first paragraph, I've identified the main objectives of the private sector organisations, which is to make profits, which most of you identified. However, something that no one identified clearly was that private sector organisations might have a degree of objectives, so lots of different objectives depending whether they are a commercial or social enterprise, or whether they're a for-profit or not-for-profit organisations. Okay, this prevented a lot of you from getting the full 4 marks because you simply did not identify that in the private sector you've got lots of different organisations with lots of different objectives. Then in contrast, public sector organisations mainly exist to provide programs and services that are to the public benefit. Okay, so this would give me 2 marks. Okay, and then now I'm going to relate this knowledge to the article. So in the example of the Salang tunnel, it is unclear whether an organisation from the public or private sector will fund the project. Okay, so just a little bit of a background. That's not necessarily even required. But the public sector, so i.e. Afghan government, so I'm showing, so let me just change that, Afghan government. I'm showing that I understand the Afghan government is a public sector in this article. Recognises that a new tunnel needs to be built. So again, I'm relating it to the article, and would be focused on providing free or inexpensive access to the tunnel for its people, as this will help the economy and bring wider benefits to society. So again, I'm linking it to the fact that it's for the public benefit. Now for the private sector, in contrast, a for-profit organisation. So I'm making a distinction that in this case we're probably dealing with a for-profit organisation. In the private sector would most likely focus more on maximising their profit from this project. So again, most likely showing the examiner that I realise it might not necessarily be the case. Okay, because there might be lots of reasons, objectives for this project. So the most likely one is they want to maximise their profits, but maybe they're not bothered even if they just break even on this project because they think it's going to lead to other projects where they can maximise their profits. Or maybe this is going to be their showcase project that's going to lead to further work all over the world in difficult situations. So again, as long as they don't break even or minimize their losses, they might be more than happy to do it in this particular situation. So just showing the examiner you realize this. And then I've put an example. So for example, they could charge a toll for access to the tunnel, okay, in order to maximize those profits. So again, linking back to this point here. So if you did something like that, that would have got you full 4 marks. Okay, and as I said, the biggest thing that limited most of your marks is this point here, the fact that you didn't identify that they might have a whole range of objectives. Okay, so I'll just linger on the mark scheme here. So again, lots of you were here. You identified the two concepts, okay, fairly clearly, although you missed out the fact that it was a they might have different objectives rather than profits, and you tried to link it to the article. Okay. Right, moving on to question 2. As you can see, this is discuss, which means evaluate. Okay, so this is the advantages and disadvantages. Okay, so therefore the question is saying you need to evaluate, okay, but talk about the advantages and disadvantages. When it says this, you normally need to do at least 2 of each. Okay, and this is the advantages and disadvantages of the proposed public-private partnership. Some of you actually talked about the advantages and disadvantages of building the actual tunnel, which restricted your mark here significantly because you didn't actually answer the question. Okay, so again, here's a link that you could potentially use, and I'll put this document on Pomoja for you. But you needed to identify a couple of advantages. Okay, so I went down this list, looked at 2 of the most significant advantages, and then looked at maybe some of the disadvantages as well, and then I developed them in my answer. As you can see, there's absolutely loads to go at. You couldn't possibly have put all these information in, okay, but even though we said 2 advantages and disadvantages, if you did 3 of each, even better. Okay, but more than that, you won't have time in your exam to fully develop those, and you'll lose marks because you haven't analysed those advantages and disadvantages in detail. Okay, so if we look at the sample answer, I've got a little bit of a introduction here, just to show that there's advantages and disadvantages, and set the context. And straight away I've dived in with some evaluation, okay, some judgment. I'm saying this is the biggest advantage, okay, so this advantage in this paragraph is the biggest advantage, and for the Afghan government in this particular case, because they haven't got the budget. Okay, so therefore it will give them the finance for the project to go ahead. So that's the biggest advantage from my point of view. It will also impose budgetary certainty. Okay, so it allows them to know that after the construction that it will also be maintained. Okay, so it's talking about the short term and the long term. It's also talking them flipping over to maybe a small disadvantage, that the Afghan government might be concerned that in the long run it might actually cost more doing it as a PPP. However, their priority should be the wider impacts and benefits the Afghan citizens and the economy would receive from the tunnel, okay, such as a greater trade and economic growth. So again, I'm showing some judgment here by saying, look, this is a great biggest advantage. There's a small disadvantage here, but their priority should be the long-term benefits, okay, and maybe not focusing too much on this extra bit of money, because they're going to make loads more money by the tunnel being available. Okay, so moving down. However, the second one, it's highly likely that they're going to use a private organisation, even if they didn't go down the PPP route. So therefore, using the PPP is going to allow the private sector to be more incentivised, because things can be built into the structure of the PPP. Also, it's going to ensure that maybe if they structure it right, that there's a transfer of skills of technology leading to further employment. All these things may contribute further to the quality of the tunnel. Okay, the fact that the private sector are more incentivised, they're going to be more bothered about quality and finishing on time. They're also going to be able to transfer the skills and technology to the people. Okay, big advantage. However, the transfer of the risk from the public to the private sector, which is normally one of the major advantages of a PPP, is not going to be very, potentially not significant in this project, because there's lots of uncertainties and the private sector might not be prepared to take these on. This means that the the process of selecting suitable firms to work maybe take a long time, and the number of partners that are willing to be involved might be limited. So this means that the Afghan government might need to take on some of those costs, uncertainties and those risks themselves in order to attract the best partners. Okay. It's also possible that the project might fail because of all the unpredictable things and the state of the fragile government and so forth, or even the failure of the private operator who doesn't foresee some of the complications. While some of these issues will be able to be addressed in the PB agreement, it's likely that some of them will need to be managed during the course of the project, and the fact that the Afghan government is not experienced and there's might be cultural differences may mean that it might take a long time to resolve and move forward, when some unforeseen things might happen during the project. The government will still be held accountable also, maybe also a disadvantage. It's not like they're passing all the responsibility onto the private contractor and they can blame them, because at the end of the day it'd be the government who hires a private contractor and who is managing them. So this could cause them not to have a re-election. So again, I'm talking about the advantages and disadvantages from different stakeholders' points of view. Although there are disadvantages, so my final summary, moving forward with a PPP represents the best solution. So I'm coming to a judgment, okay? And it's the best solution for the Afghan government because of the thing I mentioned before. It allows them to have access to finance. It's also going to have the added benefit, if they structure the PPP successfully, that is going to transfer valuable knowledge and skills to the country that can be used elsewhere in the long term. Okay, so again, I've used long term, which is evaluation. I'm showing judgment that there's long-term advantages as well as the short-term advantages of having the tunnel actually finished. Some of the disadvantages will still be there if they complete the project as a wholly public project anyway. Okay, those uncertainties are still going to be there. Those costs and those risks they would have to take on themselves anyway. So maybe it's not a disadvantage of the PPP after all. That they would always be a disadvantage of the project, and other ones could be within the Afghan government's control, in order to by setting up appropriate systems to monitor the project, are going to reduce the maybe likelihood of it failing, and the disadvantage of maybe not getting re-elected, offering a solution that they can maybe get consultants to help them with this. Okay, that's a big evaluation. Okay, let me change this to a comma, and then a final statement. Overall, the Afghan government need to look at this project as being the first of many, and one that will build its own competencies in PPPs. So the fact that, yeah, it's going to be a difficult project, but maybe they should be thinking about, yeah, this is going to really build our competencies and experience, and we can use these skills in future PPPs to develop other infrastructure projects. Okay, so again, there was some general feedback from question 2 that I've already mentioned. Some that you focused on the advantages and disadvantages of building the tunnel as opposed to the advantages and disadvantages of the PPP. Some of you didn't provide a final conclusion or judgment. You just did advantages and disadvantages. Okay, or you came to a completely different conclusion. Okay, in the final paragraph, which wasn't even in contention before. So it looked like you were saying PPPs were a really good thing when you were doing the advantages and disadvantages, and then you just threw in one new argument in your conclusion that seemed to be going against what you have been saying in the rest of the answer. Remember, there's no right or wrong answers in business and management. Okay, as long as your answers make sense, they're logical, and they're clear. Okay, some students incorrectly assume that a PPP would involve foreign investors only. Okay, so just show the examiner that you realise that actually domestic firms could be involved. Maybe that could have been part of the PPP process in the first place. The fact that any foreign businesses would need to partner or do a joint venture with a domestic business, and that would actually ensure that there was knowledge and skill transfer to domestic people and businesses. Okay, and some are fairly straightforward that I've mentioned going through here. The fact that maybe you spoke too generally, you just talked about advantages and disadvantages of PPP. That could apply to any country in any situation. Some of you focus more on advantages than disadvantages, okay, which meant that you didn't have a balanced argument. Right, so the major take home from this summative assessment is lots of you did pretty well. Okay, there was no major disasters or major things that I'm worried about. We can build on these things, but the main target for all of you is just to answer the question. Most of you at some points included lots of information that didn't help you answer the question in one way or another. Okay.